exactly. It's a great pleasure to introduce Rob Gleave from Exeter University. I'll let him introduce his subject. He's our keynote this morning. So with no further ado, I'll hand you across to Rob.
Very well, Simon. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation and for bringing together such an interesting set of papers yesterday. It's always good for Islamic studies people to get out of their box. We live in quite a small world in many ways, and we don't always expose our ideas to wider audiences. So I'm learning an enormous amount, and I suppose one of the things which I have to apologize for those of you that work in this area, is my lack of methodological sophistication. Because Islamic studies doesn't always have the frameworks which you've been working on in the religious studies and in other areas. It's been curiously resistant to the introduction of sort of methodological theory. So in terms of the understanding of religious movements within Islam and the comparison between Islam and other things. So I'm really hoping that one of the things which I will learn from you all today is how I can make linkages between the work that I've been doing here and other things in order to set them in a broader methodological framework. So I wanted to talk about Islam, Messianism and Justified Violence. And that is how the moral principles and the structure, if you like, of morality, which in traditional Islamic thought, normally referred to as Sharia, how this is affected by strong and fervent messianic expectations. So it's in some ways an examination of how Messianism as a religious belief affects the moral structure of traditionally held elements of Islamic thought. So I hope that will become relatively clear as I move through the presentation. So just an outline of what I'm hoping to do. A little bit about what I'm presuming a reasonably low familiarity with detailed notions of messianism and millenarianism within the Islamic framework. I hope that's appropriate. If it gets too simple, just wave and I can flip on those slides and we can move on to the more complicated stuff. But so I'll do that at the beginning. And this will build on some of the things which Mujan was talking about yesterday. So it was very useful that he came before because he's covered a lot of the things which I was going to cover. And hopefully that means that I can zip through those because you've all absorbed what Mujan was talking about. And we'll be able to move straight on to some of the things which I want to do, looking at some case studies which are not, which weren't covered by Mujan yesterday. So looking at, in a sense, if one of the questions I want to ask is how is moral and legal justification for violence affected by the introduction of messianic theological commitment? How does that change the way in which these movements think about the morality of justified violence? In order to do that, you need to understand a little bit about how violence is generally justified within the Islamic legal tradition. So I'll do a little bit on that. And then I'd like to look at some examples, two Sunni examples and two Shiite examples. Well, we might get on to three Shiite examples. Depends on how the time goes. And I'll do that. And then some concluding remarks, which are not particularly profound, I have to say, unless something profound comes to me in the next half an hour, in which case they might be super profound. But my suspicion is they won't be very profound. And I would look forward to comments and queries afterwards. Okay. So, those of you that are unfamiliar, there is a number of messianic themes or millenarial themes, you might find them, within the sort of foundational texts of Islam. In particular, within the Quran, the revelation to the Prophet Muhammad, which, according to Muslim belief, he began receiving revelations in 610, and he continued to receive them at intervals through the agency of the angel Gabriel until his death in 632. And within those revelations, there are a series of what you might call apocalyptic or millenarial themes. The Quran itself is not a huge book, and it's got an elliptical style in that everything is hinted at and not always explained in full. So apocalyptic references are not dissimilar to the rest of the Quranic passages in that they don't always spell out precisely what's going to happen in the last days. They're much less detailed, for example, than the Book of Revelation, although, as we all know, something like the Book of Revelation is subject to multiple interpretations. But compared to that, the apocalyptic material within the Quran is remarkably unprecise. But there are some references which it might be worth bearing in mind. Most of them revolve around the notion of the coming of the hour, which is code for the end of the world. The key element to the beginning is that no one knows when it will come, and that this knowledge is only known to God. And a reference such as this, where men ask you about the hour, say the knowledge of it is with Allah only. What can convey the knowledge to you? It may be that the hour is nigh. It may not be that the hour is nigh as well. So the knowledge of the actual end times, the Quran regularly references, and early Islamic theology also regularly references the idea that this is actually known only to God, and those that say that they know it have somehow crossed a boundary. Another example is, of what you might call apocalyptic text is something like when heaven is split apart, when the planets are dispersed, when the seas are poured forth and the graves are overturned, a soul will know it, what it has put forward and what it has left behind. The Quran contains, and these are just examples, the Quran contains a number of these sort of apocalyptic visions of what it will be like at the end time, without specifying necessarily a date. The lack of the claim in the Quran that no one knows the hour except for Allah has not necessarily, as we shall see, prevented certain movements saying that they do know what the hour is, that they've received some special message which enables them to do so. The second source which most Muslims turn to when they want to construct their theological framework is the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. And amongst the things which the Prophet Muhammad, there are many sayings of the Prophet Muhammad collected in huge books which Muslims have read, and Muslim theologians and jurists have read and debated as to the meaning of them. But amongst the ones which I'm just giving you some examples is the Prophet made mention of 10 things. The smoke that will come at the end of the time. The smoke, the Dajjal, which is normally in time translated as the Antichrist, the coming of the Antichrist, the beast, the rising of the sun in the west, the descent of Jesus, the son of Mary, Gog and Magog, and landslides in 3 places, one in the east, one in the west, one in Arabia, at the end of which fire would burn forth from Yemen and would drive people to their place of assembly. So this is a sort of a set of signs which are laid out by the Prophet Muhammad of the coming of the hour. So if we turn then to Islamic Messianism, so those are the sort of base texts, if you like. They don't dictate a particular theology. They are the sources from which early Muslim theologians constructed what they did in order to create apocalyptic. In terms of what has been the messianic beliefs within Islam over the centuries, well, as Mujan was saying yesterday, there are really 2 broad streams, if you like, of messianic construction within the Muslim theological tradition. And these roughly assign to the Sunni and the Shi'i branches. And we'll talk a little bit about each one of them in what I have to say. The Sunni notion is that there will be a time when Jesus returns in order to usher in a millennial period, which is debated whether it will be 3, 5, 7 or 8 years. The Mahdi, this is the notion which Mujan mentioned yesterday, the idea of a returned figure who will come alongside Jesus and fight the Antichrist, who will rise up, will eventually be victorious, and then we will face the day of judgment. The actual details of how any of those elements of the story might happen have been subject to wide interpretation and embellishment in Muslim theology, in Sunni Muslim theology. And in a sense that's been permitted within the theological realm, because this is something we don't know about, something which we can speculate about, and therefore it's not something which defines whether you are a Muslim or not a Muslim within the Sunni theological tradition. Being precise about what the details are of what's going to happen at the end of the world is not one of the fundamentals of faith. That you believe that there will be a day of judgment is fundamental. What it's going to be like is not fundamental. So it's not seen as a deciding factor as to whether you are part of the community, in the Sunni Muslim terms, part of the community or not. So that gives, if you like, license to theologians and others to speculate about what it's going to be like, and consequently there has been wide speculation. There are things which actually decide whether you're part of the community or not, fundamental beliefs, but the precise nature of what's going to happen at the end times is not one of them. The Shi'i Mahdi, this notion of the Mahdi, which the messianic figure, is referred to in the literature as the Qa'im al-Muhammad, the one who will rise up from the people of Muhammad. And Shi'i notions of what will happen at the end times include also the return of Jesus, the Mahdi's return with Jesus, to establish a rule of justice on earth. And they will face opposition from so-called Muslims. These are not members of the true faith according to the Shi'i beliefs. They are people who will fight the Mahdi and his army, but they're not true Muslims. And they will be led by the Antichrist, and once that battle has happened, then there will be another battle which will be with someone called the Sufyani. But eventually there will be victory and a period of rule by the Mahdi, which will then end with the Day of Judgment. Once again, as with the Sunni version, there are enormous numbers of embellishments, and what I give you here is a rough framework. Some bits may be missing in some versions, some may be inserted in other versions, and there's been enormous speculation in the Shi'i tradition as well as the Sunni tradition about what's going to happen. So, when we're talking about violence, I suppose, how does violence get justified within the Islamic moral and legal tradition generally? Or how does anything get justified, you might say? Because one of the things which is becoming clear to me as I work more and more on this is that there is not a special form of legal reasoning or moral reasoning which Muslim thinkers have applied in the past to acts of violence as if they are different from other acts. So the method of justification for any act, whether it's violent or not violent, is the same. That is, that violence doesn't have a special position within their thinking. Indeed, there's no real word for violence within the Muslim moral legal tradition. That's not to say that there's no violence there. There's lots of violence described within the Muslim legal tradition. Justifications for violence in different ways. I'll talk about those in a second. But there's no concept of violence that requires special treatment, that requires a particular set of sensibilities around its moral assessment. So, how you justify anything is, in a sense, how you justify violence. And so the sources of justification, well, there are textual, what you might call textual sources, revelation. The Muslims will look to the Quran or to the Sunnah, which is the Arabic word for the example of the Prophet Muhammad. And for Shiites, not just the Prophet Muhammad, but also those who were designated by the Prophet Muhammad to be leader of the community after his death, and are considered sinless examples, if you like, of perfect obedience to God's law. So the Sunnah is a expansive notion of example, of good example, and the Quran, of course, is a text. How do we know what the Sunnah is? Well, we know what the Sunnah is because we have sayings of what the Prophet Muhammad said and did. We have texts which record what he said and did at particular points in time. Unlike the Quran, these texts are disputed as to whether they are reliable or not reliable. The Quran is accepted by nearly all Muslim groups as a definitive text, whereas the Sunnah is much more elastic. So, justifying any action, violent or non-violent, the Muslim legal theory, if you like, is first of all you look in the Quran and then you look in the sayings of the Prophet to see if there's anything there which might indicate that this is allowed or even obligatory. Then there is the notion of communal agreement. That is, that if something can't be found within the revelation, Muslim legal theorists have invented a second category of revelation after revelation. That is, that when the community agrees upon something, community agreement, when the community agrees upon something, this is supposed to enable certainty to be known about what it is that they agree on, whether it's a theological matter or a legal matter. Getting community agreement is not a simple thing, as one can imagine. It exists as a theoretical category, and it exists as something which is claimed on a regular basis by thinkers. But of course, it's disputed. I suppose once it's disputed, that means that there's no longer community agreement on something, so it sort of becomes a defunct category. But it's there as a very important sort of theoretical element. I've used the sort of an English phrase, valid argumentation here. That is that what's hinted at within the Quran and Sunnah may not explicitly apply to the thing that you want to know about now. But is there a way of using the text of the Quran and Sunnah to expand it? The classic example they always use is the prohibition on the consumption of alcoholic liquids. That is that the Quran does not specifically mention anything other than grape wine as forbidden to be consumed. However, Muslims don't just abstain from drinking grape wine, they abstain from all alcoholic beverages, as many of you will know. So how do we get to that rule? We get to the rule because the reason why we work out the reason why God prohibited the consumption of grape wine, and the reason why he prohibited grape wine, according to most Muslim legal theorists, is because of its intoxicating quality. Once we know the reason why God prohibited grape wine, if we can work that out, then we can apply it to new circumstances. And, the classic example is always date wine made from dates. This is also to be prohibited because it has the same intoxicating qualities as grape wine. It's not as strong as grape wine normally, but it still has the intoxicating qualities, so consequently it should be prohibited. And that enables Muslims to say that whiskey is forbidden and Bacardi Breezer is forbidden, and all of these other elements of all these other types of alcoholic drinks are forbidden because they intoxicate. But the text doesn't explicitly say, the Quranic text does not explicitly say that the intoxication is the reason behind it. That was a process of argumentation which went on in the early Muslim community.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
I apologise for interrupting you speaking. When you move into consensus and valid argumentation, can that only take place in Arabic? Sorry, do I just speak this? I'm just wondering about the languages that are used for this. Can it only be in Arabic? Because I understand that the Quran is only fully the Quran when it's in Arabic.
Yes.
Or can scholars within Islamic thought use other languages? I guess that would particularly apply to Shia and Parsi and those languages. How far is it acknowledged across the community,
there are
if you will?
strict rules over who's allowed to actually perform this sort of legal reasoning. So there are strict rules over who's allowed to do it, and i.e. only a qualified scholar is permitted to do it. You can't There may be a qualified scholar in the room, but let's presume that there's not. None of us are allowed to perform this mode of legal reasoning in order to come up with a rule at the end, because we haven't been trained, we haven't been gone through the necessary qualifications in order to reach the point where we are now skilled enough to read through these sources and work out what the rule might be. And for that, and amongst that, and central to that training, is total mastery of the Arabic language. Whether your first language is Arabic or not, your first language isn't Arabic, a basic element of the qualification to perform, if you like, moral assessment is, for both the Sunni and the Shi'i traditions, mastery of the Arabic language, even if Arabic isn't your first language. And so, because you will only be able to know, understanding the reason why, for example, God prohibited alcoholic drinks requires a detailed knowledge of what God might be implying within the Quranic text, or what the Prophet might have been implying when he mentioned something in his statement, in his statements. And you can only understand implication, if you like, non-explicit communication, when you know the language extremely well. We all have this. We've all experienced this when we don't know a language very well. We end up misinterpreting something, which, if you knew the language well, because it was implied in what the person said, and but it wasn't explicit enough for you as a non-native speaker to understand it. In the same way, if you're going to do this legal reasoning, you need to know Arabic well in order to find out what is explicit and what is not explicit.
Thank you.
Okay. So valid argumentation enables us to come to legal conclusions. And finally, a disputed source is reason. That is, that reason, unconnected, if you like, with the textual revelation. How much can we work out from our own minds on their own? Some Muslims have said, not very much in terms of moral assessment. You don't have the power to decide whether killing or lying is right or wrong, purely from your own reason. You need revelation to provide you with that knowledge. That is that until revelation comes and tells you that killing and lying is wrong, they are unassessed. You can't work out whether they're good or bad on your own. So some Muslims have argued that revelation is central and essential for that. Other Muslims have said there are certain things you can work out from your own mind. Things like killing and lying, you can know that they are inherently wrong. This has been a recurrent debate in the history of Muslim thought as to what extent can reason, unaided by revelation, produce moral assessments. And it continues to this day. Broadly speaking, Sunni jurists have said the scope for reason is limited. They've debated on how much limited, but the scope for reason to make moral assessments outside of revelation is limited. And Shiites have said that the scope for reason is more broad. So having said all of that, we look at what forms of violence are justified in Islamic thought. Well, physical warfare is justified in the legal textbooks. There's a description of how you go about performing a jihad in great detail in the legal textbooks. The notions of punishment, this is a form of violence which is permitted. That is to punish people for acts which they performed which are seen as crimes against God, known as the hudud. Compensation and retaliation. So, for example, if one commits a homicide, one commits a murder of someone in another family, that family has the right to retribution on you personally, and that can include violent acts. And it includes if you injure someone else. That person is permitted, generally speaking, according to Islamic legal framework, to commit the same damage to you as you did as you did to him or her. And finally, discipline and control. This is a much debated area. For example, there is an implication in one of the Quranic verses that one's allowed to beat one's wife if she is disobedient. Muslims have debated what this verse might mean. Some have said that it legitimizes husbands disciplining their wives in a particular way. Others have said that you've got to understand it metaphorically, and that's a huge debate. But it is an area, particularly with regard to children or with regard to slaves. For example, slavery is an institution which is described in these textbooks, and disciplining one's own slaves is seen as a permitted act of violence, you might say. So these are the areas where Islamic legal thought has legitimized violence within very strict rules and regulations as to what you can do and what you can't do, and how you can do it, and under what circumstances you're permitted to do it. It's outlined in extreme detail in this tradition as to what's permitted and what's not permitted. It's not a free-for-all. That's the point that I want to go. Okay, so the question is, which I want to look at through a few examples in the time I've got remaining, how does the imminent appearance of the Messiah or the imminent establishment of messianic rule or the coming of the end times and the apocalypse, this bundle of ideas, how does this affect the ethical legal framework of the Sharia, which I've just described to you? Does it make it any difference? And does it permit things which otherwise wouldn't be permitted, or does it actually make no difference? So it's worth going through a few examples. First example was the Meccan Revolt in 1979. So 1979 was a tumultuous year in the Muslim world. Not only did we have the Iranian Revolution earlier in the year, we also had, in November, the takeover of the sanctuary in Mecca by somewhere between 400 and 500 followers of Juhayman al-Utaybi, who was a seminary student, Sunni seminary student, who said that his brother-in-law, Muhammad al-Qahtani, was the Mahdi. And the 20th of November was a significant date because it was the first date of the year 1400 in the Islamic calendar. So the date was selected as the date at which the Mahdi's appearance was to be proclaimed. So so this is a picture of Juhayman after his capture, which sort of, sorry, that's a spoiler. So we don't have any pictures of him before his capture, unfortunately. He proclaimed that the Saudi royal family's rule of the Arabian Peninsula was to come to an end. The rule of the Mahdi was to begin. He believed in a total separation of believers from unbelievers, and that the new rule of the Mahdi would enable believers to band together and form this cohesive unit. Saudi security forces, led by Prince Turki al-Faisal, who was ambassador to London for some time afterwards, I've met him on a couple of occasions. He was head of the internal security forces. Tried to end the seizure of the sanctuary, which includes, of course, the Kaaba, the black stone to which Muslims turn when they pray. It's the central holy site for Muslims, and he used Pakistani and French security forces in order to storm the area after a couple of weeks of attempted negotiation and ultimately failed the negotiation. And they did try and storm it on a number of occasions. They went underneath to try and gas the insurgents. And were unsuccessful. And of course, they were keeping some hostages in there because when they had raided the Kaaba, when they first arrived, it was prayer time. It was dawn on the first day of the new year, And though they released some hostages, they kept some hostages. And so the security forces were wary of that as well. And eventually they decided, sorry, that's not a great picture. We haven't got great pictures of this, by the way. It's something which would not well documented. So they raided it, and these are the French security forces who came, with some of the French security forces. We only know officially that there were 4. Officially, there were only 4. There may have been more, but we will never know. The crucial point is that they had to convert to Islam before they were allowed to raid the Kaaba area. And so the Saudi security forces contacted the top scholars of the land who validated their conversion to Islam, because no non-Muslim is allowed to enter the sanctuary area. So they converted to Islam and were able to participate in the raid, which resulted in ultimately 255 dead, 580 injured. Qahtani was killed, Al-Utaybi was captured, there was a trial, and in January, or was it February, so it was quite quick, he was beheaded, along with 62 other people who were part of the revolt, in public places around Saudi Arabia, in order to make this, in public squares around Saudi Arabia in different cities. The crucial point here is that this is the beginning of the resentment between the older generation of what we call Salafi scholars and the younger generation. It was a sign of the breakup, if you like, of the Salafi generations, and which was to have important effects later on in the 1990s. That is that the Saudi educational policy of training people within seminaries was giving rise to a young generation of Salafi scholars who were feeling that they had the license to interpret the religion of Islam in the way that they wished to do so. The deference to established figures was beginning to break down, and the Juhayman activity, the Juhayman event was, if you like, part of that. Let's turn to a second example, which of course is more recent, but a lot of scholars draw a straight line between what happened in Mecca in 1979 and the rise of Islamic State, because the rise of Islamic State is like what happened in Mecca, but amplified, if you like, and with greater military capability. Obviously, as you probably know, Islamic State uses apocalyptic notions as part of its recruitment tool. There is one of the emphasis that they have is on fear of missing out. That is that the FOMO appeal of Islamic State. They say to young potential recruits across the world that the end times are coming, and you want to be part of the agency which is going to bring about those end times. I.e., you want to come to Syria and be part of these cataclysmic events which are about to happen. And in particular, amongst the things which they've been successful is the focus on these 2 towns, these 2 areas, one an area, one a town, where supposedly this battle between the forces of Christianity and the forces of Islam is going to take place, and this will be the sort of cataclysmic end of times battle. And there is a statement. There is a statement in one of the collections of hadith that the last hour would not come until the Romans would land at Al-A'maq or in Derbic. So these 2 places, A'maq and Derbic, well, you can see Derbic is here. It was part of Islamic State territory up until October last year. A'maq is supposedly in Syria, south of Taqiyya there. These are 2 places mentioned in the hadith as having apocalyptic significance, and consequently Islamic State have decided to use these 2 themes. For example, its news agency is called the A'maq News Agency, which tells about the victories or otherwise of Islamic State, and you can get AppMac Agency app, download onto your Android, should you feel brave enough to do so. I've not done it. I'm a purely Apple man myself. Of course, Apple is forbidden within Islamic State territory. You're not allowed to have any Apple products within Islamic State territory. They believe that there's a homing device or an identifying device in an Apple phone, which means that any of their fighters have Apple products on them. The US government knows exactly where they are, and so they can send a drone to kill them. So you're not allowed to have Apple products within Islamic State territory. And then perhaps more famously, there is Dabiq, which is the magazine of the end times, which is used, English language magazine, which is used in order to try and gain recruits, playing on the notion of Dabiq being the location of the apocalyptic battle, and it has suitably apocalyptic themes as part of its front page headlines. So we have here, which is the flood, and a series of articles. It's either Islamic State or the flood, and Dabiq until it burns the Crusader armies in Dabiq. So this is once again a apocalyptic theme which has been used in their magazine, playing on the notion of Dabiq as the location of a apocalyptic battle. Here is a sort of schematic representation of Islamic State's prediction of the end times, which one finds in some jihadi literature. The return of the prophetic caliphate, we're here at the minute. Okay? We will face the Mahdi appearing in Mecca. We will fight the Romans in Dabiq. So this is to happen after the appearance of the Mahdi. Conquer Constantinople, conquer Rome, Antichrist appears in Iran, Jesus descends in Damascus, Jesus and Muslims fight the Antichrist and the Jews, Gog and Magog rampage, perfumed wind kills Muslims, sinners face cataclysm, end of judgment. End of times judgment. So this is one schematic way in which it's laid out within the literature. Of course, there are many different versions of this, and it's not known with certainty. There's not an official Islamic State line, but there's certainly an enormous amount of discussion. So, Islamic State's justification of violence, and to an extent Juhayman's Al-Utaybi's justification of violence, is a standard Salafi message, which is an emphasis on Quran and Sunnah. That is, that there has been a deviation, if you like, a move away from proper understanding of Quran and Sunnah. And Islamic State in particular have said that this caliphate, which they're establishing in Syria and Iraq, is a crucial element of the legitimacy of the violence that they carry out. But it's not a special sort of violence. All it is for them a proper implementation of the Sharia. It's not as if the violence which they are perpetrating is a special sort of violence for the end times. It's purely an inevitable consequence of the proper implementation of God's law, which has only been followed in pockets over the time since Muhammad's death. So, from their perspective, this isn't distinctively apocalyptic violence. It's just the inevitable element of the implementation of God's law. They do predict that there will be violence to come, which will have a particular set of conditions. But this violence, which they're performing now, is in line with the Sharia. It's not a new Sharia; it's the Sharia, which has existed for many hundreds of years, but been ignored by many Muslims. This is a standard sort of Salafi rhetoric, in the sense that we need to restore some form of purity to Islam. Have we got issues? The crucial point that they argue is that the establishment of Islamic State will hasten the arrival of the Mahdi. It doesn't give them license to do things which wouldn't have been permitted in other circumstances, but they do see the establishment of the caliphal state, or at least they portray this as part of their rhetoric. They do see this as the hastening the arrival of the Mahdi. Okay. There is, of course, this book, if you are interested in knowing more, in which the theological foundations of Islamic states doomsday vision by William McCants is outlined in detail. There may be issues with the book, and we were discussing it last night. I see the apocalyptic as part of an Islamic State rhetoric necessarily than fundamental to Islamic State's hierarchical beliefs. I think it's something which they use to recruit, but it may not be actually fundamental to the strategy of Islamic State in their activities. But nonetheless, it's a very interesting book, and it contains lots of information about how their strategy has been developed. If I turn to those are the two Sunni examples that I wanted to give: the Juhayman, al-Utaybi, raid of the Meccan century, and Islamic State's use of apocalyptic. If we look at the Twelver Shiite tradition, Twelver Shi'ism, and much of this was outlined by Mujan yesterday, theologically speaking, Shi'ism is a more intense form of Islamic messianism, in the sense that from the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, Shiites believe that the community opted for one person to be the leader when they should have opted for someone who was designated by the Prophet Muhammad and related to the Prophet Muhammad, who should have been the leader. Okay, and that person was known as Ali, who was a cousin of the Prophet and married to the Prophet's daughter. And not only was he supposedly the leader of the Muslim community, all of his descendants are somehow specially blessed with a power which enables them to be the rightful leaders of the community. And this rightful leadership is passed on from generation to generation by a process of designation. Now, this process of designation, which establishes the rightful leadership of the next generation, has been completely ignored by the majority of the Muslim community. So Shiites have lived with a history of injustice and oppression because the rightful leaders of the community have been completely ignored by the majority Sunni community. Twelver Shiites are one branch of Shi'ism which believe that there were 12 of these leaders after the Prophet Muhammad, the last of which went into occultation, as Mujan was explaining yesterday. This occultation was a disappearance, and the hidden imam, the occluded imam, is present in the world somewhere and will make himself known again at some future point. But his presence, this isn't a messianism in which the Messiah is absent and will return. This is a messianism in which the Messiah is present in the world, could be in this room. Indeed, some moral, legal reasoning relies on the notion that one of the people who may be contributing to a moral assessment could be the hidden imam. We don't know. So the hidden imam is hidden but present in the world. And what does this mean for Shiites, Twelver Shiites in their everyday life? Well, certain values have been emphasized. Patience during the imam's absence. That is that you may well see the imam's return, but you just have to be patient and wait. Dissimulation if necessary. That is, you can pretend to not be a Shiite if it's going to protect you. If you face oppression from the Sunni majority over the way in which you pray or some of the statements that you make, because Shiites and Sunnis, well, Sunnis differ in the precise movements of ritual prayer. Shiites differ from Sunnis in the precise movements of ritual prayer. For example, if by praying in a particular way you're going to advertise the fact that you're Shiite, you are permitted to just pray in the way that the Sunnis pray. You know, doing all the hand motions and that the Sunnis do. So dissimulation is a permitted tactic, if you like, for self-preservation in order to protect the community. And you have to live in expectation of the 12th Imam's return. So the Imam's appearance is an uncovering of the Imam, rather than a return, if you like. In the theological notion, the Imam is seen as having full Sharia knowledge. That is, full knowledge of all the rulings which God has given to humankind to follow until the day of judgment. So when I go back to the way in which Muslims have worked out what the moral assessment for something might be, they follow this procedure. The Imam doesn't need to follow that procedure. The Imam is blessed with a direct line to God, which enables him to know whether this act or that act is good or bad, or permitted, or obligatory, or forbidden, or any of the assessments which exist in Islamic law. Now this means, and this is a structural notion within Shiite moral thought, this means that all ethical and legal judgments are inherently provisional during the occultation. That is, any ethical or legal judgment that I come up with de jure cannot be the ruling of God. It's always my ruling, because the only person who knows the ruling of God is the Imam himself. And if I claim that the ruling which I've made for this particular event is the ruling of God, I am arrogating myself, pretending, if you like, that I have the sinlessness of the hidden Imam himself. So all ethical and legal judgments are, epistemologically speaking, provisional. And this includes notions of the legitimacy of violence. So this provisionality of the law also facilitates dissimulation. Because if all law is provisional by nature, because the hidden Imam is not here to communicate with us and tell us what the ruling assessments are, this in a sense means that what I might say as a scholar, imagine that I'm a scholar, make that leap of imagination, just for the purposes of of presentation. If I was a scholar and I was to make a particular ruling, that would not be the ruling of God. It would be my opinion as to what the ruling of God might be. This creates a sort of epistemological uncertainty in that ruling, which means that it no longer is a reflection, if you like, a sure reflection of God's rule. This means that if I was to not follow it, it's not quite as serious as not following the law of God. So dissimulation, when by necessity I'm not going to follow the Shiite way of doing things, I'm going to have to follow the Sunni way of doing things, is less of it creates less moral turpitude, let's put it that way. So the provisionality, if you like, of all legal judgments in the Shiite system is linked to the messianic belief that pure knowledge of the Sharia is impossible in the absence of the Imam. Now, Sunnis also have the notion of provisionality of judgment, but they have the possibility that I might be right. Or the possibility, if you like, that if I work really, really hard and do the analysis correctly of the sources, I will come up with the rule which is the same as the rule of God. In the Shiite system, theoretically speaking, it's impossible for us to ever know that the ruling I've come up with is the same as the ruling of God. Does this mean that actually we've got no law? Well, no. So how can any action be justified given the Imam's absence is the sort of like, might be the logical conclusion of what I'm saying. Going back to the question that was asked earlier, 12 Shiite legal theory is an intellectual quest to establish a method whereby legal actions might be justified when in the absence of the imam. That's, if you like, that's the history of Shiite legal thought. It's an attempt to try and say, the imam's not present, but does that mean we have no law? No, we have a law. And if you want to know more about how they solve that problem, I can talk about it, but it's not germane to necessarily what I want to talk about here. So the standard Shiite position has been that certain acts of violence are not permitted because we do not have the imam present. Certain acts of what we might call violence are not permitted because you need the imam in order to be certain that you're going to do them properly. Amongst these are jihad and punishment. So for many Shiite jurists, these are what they call lapsed. They have disappeared from the duties which a Muslim should perform. And Mujan mentioned that over the centuries, gradually, the Shiite jurists have reclaimed parts of jihad and punishment in order to say that actually the imam has delegated us, the scholars, to enact these forms. But there are certain things that you're not allowed to do. There are certain things you're not allowed to do, but there are certain things which you are still permitted to do. So, for example, retaliation in compensation is permitted. Disciplining and controlling your children, you don't just let them run riot. You are allowed to discipline and control your children and your slaves during the occultation of the imam. You still have that power, even though it's a violent. But if you are dissimulating, which is the Arabic word is taqiyya, there is a prohibition on when you're dissimulating on the spilling of blood. So all this adds up to me that there is, whilst I said earlier that there's not a notion of violence, and not a discrete notion of violence within the Islamic legal tradition, the Shiites do have a particular taboo around causing physical harm to someone else. That it's only because of the imam's absence, they are nervous, traditionally, about allowing people to carry out acts of violence against other human beings. So the Islamic Republic of Iran, this is something which is new, because the Islamic Republic of Iran claims to be a legitimate government, even though it doesn't claim to be the government of the imam itself. It's a government of scholars on behalf of the hidden imam. I'll rush through that. If you want to ask me questions about that, then I will do. But we do have within the Islamic Republic the notion of a fear of messianism. And this was found with President Ahmedinejad, who said a number of statements to indicate that he had some sort of direct connection with the hidden imam. The traditional scholars viewed this as highly suspicious. And eventually, he was ostracized from the corridors of power as a president because of his unorthodoxy. Scholars don't want to put themselves forward as having special knowledge of what the imam's wishes might be, because some mystical knowledge, because their authority is based on scholarly understanding of texts. President Ahmedinejad was allegedly developing a notion of his personal inspiration from the hidden imam. And the traditional scholars viewed this as dangerous. So the one example which I want to go into, I won't have time for two, but I will run through this one very quickly, is the one of the ways in which Shiite messianism, which traditionally has been suppressed, can become overt. An example of this is the Army of Heaven, Junda Sama, which in January 2007, this organization was cut off and surrounded in a garden at the place called Zarqa, which is just outside Najaf in southern Iraq. So it's somewhere around about here. So here's Najaf, and the bend in the road there is this bend in the road here. And this is the garden here where they were surrounded, and with US air support and with Iraqi ground troops, the compound was raided because they were viewed as a threat to the security of Najaf. They were marching towards Najaf, and supposedly they were going to kill some of the top scholars in Najaf. That was the allegation. The US army and the Iraqi security forces raided the compound. 373 dead, including women and children. The members of the group, which was led by someone called Diyar Abd Zahra al-Qadim, he was killed, and there was over 500 arrests of the group across southern Iraq. This is the magazine which was recovered from the compound, in which this person, this is Kazim in the middle here, he claimed to be the Qadi as-Sama, the judge of heaven. And he saw himself as the one who is going to rise up from the Prophet's family. And this is just a quotation. "Know and make known that I am the one who rises from the Prophet's family. In this book there is information about my true personality. This was described by the Prophet of God," so he makes a direct reference back to the Prophet Muhammad, "and the sinless Imams," so another direct reference back to Shiite theology, "the physical characteristics and the prophetic characteristics, and the higher knowledge, and my descent from Amir al-Mu'mineen, the Prince of the Believers in Arabic, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Qadi as-Sama." So this statement, in this statement, he was putting himself forward as the representative, if you like, of the hidden Imam, probably the hidden Imam himself. It was ambiguous, but it seems pretty clear that he thought of himself as the hidden Imam, and that the group of people that he was leading were armed and were going to cause mayhem because they believed that the time for the Imam's appearance had arrived. This was obviously seen as a security threat, and the resulting raid of the garden at Zarqa and the subsequent deaths and the arrests across southern Iraq show the concern which the American and the Iraqi security forces had over the emergence of a group like this. I'll run through my, I'll miss out my second example, which is another Iraqi example, because there's been a growth of millenarial messianic movements in southern Iraq. And just talk a little bit about the conclusions, which is Sunnis, if you want to talk very broadly, Sunnis seem to have a post-millennial, and this is the only bit that I picked up from reading in the literature. We have the power to create a rule fit for the arrival of the Mahdi. And therefore, we can do this before the Mahdi arrives. And when the Mahdi arrives, we will have the perfect period after that. And because of that, preparation, if you like, for the Mahdi, there is, to an extent, an ends-justified morality, which means that violence can be justified because it creates some sort of strategic objective in the establishment of a state for the arrival of the Mahdi. The Shi'i, traditionally, not the group in Zarqa that I've just discussed, because they have crossed the boundary, if you like, but this group, the Shi'i group, the Shi'i theologians generally, you might want to call them pre-millennial. Traditionally, the theological position is that very little can be done until the Mahdi arrives. And our task is to wait and remain faithful and try and do the best that we can, given our incomplete knowledge of the Sharia, and attempt to ready ourselves, not politically, but personally, so that if the Mahdi was to arrive, we would be considered worthy members of his community. And no one's really done an application of these theoretical categories which we've been talking about a little bit in the last 2 days onto the millenarial and apocalyptic movements within Islam. And that partly is a problem with the field, but that's part of the reason why I'm very interested to hear your comments. And here is some additional reading, should you feel so brave. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Very, very interesting. I'm quite sure there will be questions. Tristan.
That was an excellent presentation. Thank you. I had a question. Something missing that you didn't talk about is the relationship between the bomb, the atomic bomb, and Iran specifically. And just at the end there, you talked about she being premillennial. But I remember reading a Noah Feldman article in the New York Times Magazine in 2002. It was a long time ago. I just reviewed it now to ask this question. And in there, he seems to vacillate between Sunni and Shia and almost conflate the two. He uses some Sunni arguments at times to justify the use of the bomb. He scales up from suicide bombing as indiscriminate violence against potentially women and children, which would go against Islamic law, and then creates this justification for Iran's use of nuclear weapons. But Noah Feldman never talks about as a kind of apocalyptic justification, but he does in there talk about how Ahmedinejad doesn't use religion as a foil for national interest, but uses national interest as a foil for religion itself, which is sort of the opposite of how we normally think about our leaders. And I wonder if you had any comment about that, and maybe if you're familiar with that article or
Yeah, I think I do remember that article. First of all, the idea that the article is based around is this notion that there are some things which are fixed in Islamic law and some things which are not fixed in Islamic law. The more you study the Islamic legal tradition is that you find out that hardly anything is fixed in Islamic law. Okay? That there's always a dispute over absolutely everything. So, for example, the killing of women and children, well, there is a sort of a base position that in the military conflict, that most jurists agree with, in the military conflict, women and children are non-combatants, as a broad category, are not to be targeted. You should only really be fighting them. However, there is also a set of provisions that if non-combatants are enabling the military operation to run smoothly, then the distinction between combatants and non-combatants sort of disappears. So, and there's debate about whether or not you can target those non-combatants who are aiding the fighters, but so it's not a hard and fast rule. Al-Qaeda, for example, have broadened the notion of non-competence, and Islamic State as well, broadened the notion of non-competence to include those people who are part of the system and are supporting the military effort against Muslims. And Al-Qaeda sometimes have argued that they are unfortunate collateral damage. i.e. you shouldn't target them, but they're unfortunate collateral damage. So there's a whole set of argumentation which goes behind every position. And as I recall from that article, the idea that there are these taboos which cannot under any circumstance be broken in Islamic legal thinking is, in a sense, optimistic in my view. Because I don't think that there are taboos, that all Islamic legal thinking, if you like, is dependent upon the interpretation of the sources, the understanding of the sources, and all of that comes from a particular intellectual framework in which the sources are interpreted in a particular way. With regard to Ahmedinejad and the use of the atomic bomb, for example, you know, he repeatedly said, "We are not developing nuclear weapons. Developing nuclear weapons is against Islam. We have no interest in doing so. This is a purely domestic program for the provision of power should oil run out and the society is dependent on the income that we get and the power that we get from oil reserves in Iran." So he continually said that. The official position of most Shiite jurists has been that the use of there's the ownership, the use, there's the production, the ownership, and the use of nuclear weapons. And each one of those is a discrete moral assessment. So is it right to produce them? Is it right to own them? Is it right to use them? And nearly all Shiite jurists have said that all three are forbidden. Not the case with Sunni jurists. So there's not a link, if you see what I mean, with the apocalyptic notion. I think there's an imagined link. Because of his interest in messianism, there's an imagined link then, well, he wants to bring about the end of the world by detonating an atomic bomb, which was the sort of rhetoric there. But I think, to an extent, we misunderstood Ahmedinejad when he was in power. I mean, he's not in power anymore, so in a sense it's history. But I think we misunderstood what it was that drove him to make the political decisions that he did. And some of them were apocalyptic, but some of them were also a deep sense of what is right and wrong for the country of Iran. And I don't know how clear he needed to be about the fact that he believed that atomic weapons were unacceptable. I mean, he repeated it on many, many occasions, just no one believed him. You know, it was ironic that no one believed him when he said that about atomic weapons, but everyone believed him when he said he thought that the Jews should be driven into the sea, and that was seen as a reason for the danger of Iran. Whereas that was quite obviously a piece of rhetoric, as far as I could tell, you know, about his opinion of the state of Israel. And Iranian public discourse is not nuanced enough to make the difference between Jews and Israel. So, you know, I think that was a sort of a bit of a series of Western fears which were fed, if you like, by the strangeness of Ahmadinejad's theological framework.
Thank you very much for that. I learned a lot. How much are the Old and New Testaments used as a source?
Very rarely. But very rarely do you find explicit reference to the Old and New Testament. However, if I go back to the case study, which I wasn't able to do, this is Ahmed al-Hassan, who's based in Basra in southern Iraq. He has a rather good website called mahdiyun.com, which has a large, it's got Arabic, Persian, and you should look it up sometime. It's quite good fun. He has followers around the world. And he has a big English section, so you know if you don't read Arabic, there's quite a lot of information. He has seen himself as the fulfillment of all prophecies: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And he describes himself, the Arabic here says Ahmed al-Hassan, the legatee and the messenger of the Imam Mahdi. So he sees himself, he's portrayed himself as a little bit like a John the Baptist figure, who is here in order to call them. So he uses the Old Testament and New Testament a lot. But he's quite unusual, well, extremely unusual, but in many ways, but specifically about the use of Christianity, of Judaism and Christianity. So most Muslim theologians, when they construct their apocalyptic, believe that they have sufficient. What's been transferred from those traditions into the Islamic framework is sufficient in order to construct the theology. They don't need to go back to the books of the Old and New Testament.
Okay, we've time for one more question. Sorry, Chris.
I can take them both together.
Could I just ask you quickly about the place of Jesus in Islamic thought? My understanding was always that Jesus was regarded as a legitimate prophet, but not the Son of God, and superseded by Muhammad. But your account of the role of Jesus in the messianic traditions within Islam, so it seems to give Jesus a totally different and much higher status than that. Can you reconcile those?
Well, you shouldn't confuse being superseded by the Prophet Muhammad as giving necessarily a low status. Okay, that the Prophet Muhammad was the final prophet does not mean that he necessarily holds a higher status than other prophets. It's just that he was the last. The return of Jesus is something which is described in the Quran, understood to be described in the Quran is probably a better way of saying it. It's understood to be described in the Quran and is a standard element. It probably historically is drawn from Christian sources into the Islamic framework, but it's certainly the return of Jesus is something which is seen as properly accorded to his status. In particular, the Muslim belief that that some Muslims believe he didn't die on the cross. It appeared as if he died, and he was raised up to heaven, and consequently never died. So his return then becomes sort of theologically possible because according to some interpretations of the Quranic verse, Jesus didn't die on the cross. It appeared as if he died.
Thank you very much indeed. A quick comment and a question. The comment is, when you were talking about FOMO, I was really struck that the propaganda to recruits is to be involved in the eschatological events as agents. And that notion of agency, which was the word that you used, really struck me very forcibly. And I think that's a crucial issue in what we're looking at here. Secondly, with regard to your scheme, was there any space there for a period of millennial bliss or not? It seemed to go straight to judgment.
Yeah, it's a bit depressing, isn't it, really? This was taken from. I mean, I didn't construct this scheme, by the way. This was taken from jihadi literature, in which this is the period when the Mahdi is able to rule and expand, fighting the Romans and defeating them in Darbit, conquering Constantinople, conquering the city of Rome. And then the Antichrist appears. And then we have a series of battles at the end of the millennial period until the final judgment. So you see what I mean? So you have it. I mean, how long this is going to be? I don't want to get your hopes up that it's going to be a long time, okay? I don't, because it could be like 7 years.
It's not an era of peace and justice.
It's an era of peace and justice. For the jihadi notion, it's an era of justice, but peace doesn't necessarily mean justice. It's an era of justice in which the message of Islam is expanded, as it should be, in order to include, these traditional enemies, if you like, of the Muslim state.
Okay, unfortunately we do have to break there. Thank you so much, Rob. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.